My Lord Bishops, ladies and gentlemen, after that introduction from Ronan, I'm afraid I'm bound to be a disappointment. I'd like to start off by saying thank you, as a citizen of this country, to the people like Ronan who've had the courage, and the people like many of you in this room, perhaps most of you in this room, who have had arguments with your friends, who have called on your neighbours canvassing, asking them to vote for life. As a citizen of this country, I want to thank you most sincerely for your courage. It will not be forgotten. I know everybody here feels a deep sense of disappointment at the decision that the Irish people took. But the arguments that we advanced during the campaign were valid then and they are valid now. They were philosophically coherent and expressed a well-thought-out value system that protects the weak and the voiceless. It's a value system that's based on respect for humanity and human life, and on the dignity and equality of all human life, and not just on sentimentality and good feelings. It is never compassionate to end the life of an unborn baby. There was no engagement during the referendum campaign by the proponents of the repeal of the Eighth Amendment with the fundamental question for us as human beings: when does life begin? When a human life should be recognised as a human person, and when it should acquire human rights. Those are very simple questions for anyone who believes in human rights. And yet, they were evaded completely during the campaign by those who prepared it: the Citizens' Assembly, the Oireachtas Committee, the Dáil, the Seanad, and those who campaigned, the big battalions that campaigned for the repeal of the Eighth. They did not face up to the fundamental question: when does a life become human, and when, therefore, ought it to have human rights? They dodged that issue. And this is notwithstanding the fact that ultrasound now enables us as in this generation to see the humanity of an unborn baby in a way that previous generations could not see. They may have had the excuse that they didn't see. We in this generation do not have that excuse, because ultrasound has enabled us to observe how human a baby is before it's born, and to then go ahead and deny that human the right to life is something very sad indeed. The pro-life movement recognises that there are rights and responsibilities. And if you were to, we also recognise that rights sometimes conflict with one another, and you have to give priority to one right over another. And what it is that enables us to prioritise rights is what we call a value system. We have a coherent value system. We recognise that the primary right is the right to life, because without being able to exercise the right to life, you have no possibility of exercising any of the other many human rights that people have. And that's why we have a hierarchy of rights as part of our value system. I asked the question to those who supported the Eighth Amendment being removed: what is their value system? What is their hierarchy of rights? If they do not put life as the number one right, what right do they put as the number one right? And if they cannot answer that question, what value system are they proposing to the Irish people? I believe that those who won this referendum have no idea how to answer that question. And that leaves a huge vacuum in the value system of Irish society, which you can fill. Do not give up. The field is there. We've got to use different methods, but the field is there to persuade the Irish people that a hierarchy of rights is necessary and that everything ought not just to be contingent and that nothing should be fundamental, which is the view of the other side. The question arises, what are we to do now? I would say that the fundamental thing we must do now is create a supportive environment for life. Now that the law is being changed and we can no longer rely on the criminal law to be a factor deterring abortion, we have to consider other ways of deterring abortion and reducing the number of abortions that occur to citizens of this country. And there is a positive agenda here. Of course, we must continue to work vigilantly at the level of the legislation. And I will be saying more about that in a few moments. There's a lot of work to be done in that, in the short run at least. But in the medium to long term, even more important work has to be done in changing the climate of opinion, in injecting a value system into the Irish people, creating a climate of opinion within families and within the wider public that will support women in making the courageous decision to allow their child to be born. We must create, as I say, a supportive environment for life. That can be encouraged by public debate and by private debate, by having the courage to speak up when nobody else will speak up at the dinner table and give the pro-life point of view, even if it makes you slightly embarrassed, if you embarrass your host. Don't be afraid to speak up and say what you believe, because what you believe is right. And indeed, there are many people who voted yes in this referendum who may well agree with you already, and certainly will begin to agree with you more and more when they begin to see what a horrible thing abortion is and that it is happening in this country. Creating a supportive environment for life will also involve solving the housing crisis. Because if people can't find a house in which to bring up a child, that creates an incentive for them perhaps not to have the child. So any one of us who might be inclined to object to a housing development in the next field should think about it a second time. Because if houses aren't built, there won't be homes for the children that we want to be born and not aborted. Likewise, creating a supportive environment for life means reforming our taxation and welfare codes so that children get adequate recognition. Children are recognised in our welfare code, but they do not exist as far as our tax code is concerned. When I entered politics first, it's a long time ago, there was such a thing as a married person's tax allowance and child tax allowances. As far as tax is concerned, children then counted for something. The cost of children was reflected in the tax that had to be paid by the breadwinner or breadwinners in the house. That's now no longer the case. There is no longer any allowance for children in the tax code. It was abolished many years ago, whereas the adult tax allowance or tax credit has been progressively increased. Our tax code has become anti-children and pro-adult. Creating a supportive environment for life will also involve making sure that adoption is made accessible as possible to those who need it, and that it is not downgraded and spoken ill of. Adoption is a pro-life solution to a crisis pregnancy in some cases. But the pro-life movement, in seeking to create a supportive environment for life, should not confine itself to this country. scandalously high levels of infant mortality in Africa and other poor countries is a pro-life issue, and we must not turn away from that. Nor must we turn away from the debates about human rights in the United Nations and in the Council of Europe. At the moment, both organisations take a very narrow view of who is human and who is entitled to have their life protected. That was not originally the case when the European Convention on Human Rights was being drawn up. It was drawn up mainly by people who are practicing Catholics and Christians. But gradually it has been reinterpreted so that the only human rights that count are the human rights of grown-up people, and that children before birth are just unpersons. That must change, and the Irish pro-life movement shouldn't confine itself solely to this country. It must use its intellectual resources, and they are considerable, to promote a better attitude at global and European level, because unfortunately we tend to be followers in this country. And if there was a development of more pro-life thinking in Europe and in the United Nations, you'd find Irish people wanting to follow in the way that perhaps they followed negative trends in the past. I'd like to say something now about the legislation, and it is very complicated legislation. I didn't understand it all myself until I went down into it in some detail. But basically, there are 5 issues, as I see it, as far as the legislation that has been produced in draft form by Minister Simon Harris and the government is concerned. First of all, I think it's unconstitutional. It's unconstitutional in the sense that Article 44(2)(1) of the Irish Constitution guarantees, subject to public order and morality, the free practice of religion. But if a person, medically qualified or otherwise, is to be forced by a threat to his or her employment of criminal sanctions, or if they do not become involved directly or indirectly in the ending of a human life against their religious convictions, then that is unconstitutional because it's an attack on their religious freedom under Article 44(2) of the Constitution. It is recognised in the legislation that a doctor or nurse or midwife shall not be compelled to carry out an abortion. That's there now, but that protection is very limited. It doesn't extend to non-medical personnel who might be involved in aiding or abetting an abortion in the theatre or elsewhere, bringing someone to the theatre or supporting them in the taking out of an abortion. In a sense, what the legislation does, it recognises that people with graduate degrees in medicine have a right to a conscience, but others involved in the medical field who might be equally involved in aiding and abetting the abortion don't have a right to a conscience. That should be changed. Likewise, Head 15 of the bill says, and this has been pointed out already, that a doctor who objects to carrying out the abortion himself or herself must, on pain of criminal sanction, make arrangements to transfer the care of the woman to somebody whom he knows or she knows will carry out the abortion. By any definition, that is saying that unless you aid and abet by transferring somebody to somebody who can do the abortion, unless you aid and abet the abortion that way, you are committing a crime. That, to my mind, is definitely unconstitutional in terms of its breach of the right to freedom of practice of religion in your daily life. I understand that doctors who are unwilling to carry out abortions are to be invited to publish their names on a list. This will, of course, mean that they will be targeted by people who are opposed to them. And there have been examples of targeting of people in other fields of endeavour where society is divided. So rather than placing this burden of referring somebody for an abortion when they don't believe an abortion is right, the solution would be for the government to say that doctors who are prepared to conduct abortions, let them publish their list, or let there be a list of them published, and people can then go to them, thereby relieving the doctors who conscientiously object to abortion of any requirement to put themselves in the sort of jeopardy that they're in. Likewise, we have a situation where if a hospital decides that it's not going to conduct abortions, that its directors, the company directors and the company secretary of the hospital could find themselves jailed for up to 14 years for refusing to conduct abortions in their institution. Sort of corporate criminality, an offence of corporate criminality for Catholic hospitals is being created. That, to my mind, is unconstitutional. There are other areas where amendments to the bill should be considered. Under head 4 of the bill, if there is a threat to the mental or physical health of the mother, a baby can be aborted until it has reached viability. Now, viability is defined very loosely and in a way that will permit abortions far too freely. Viability is defined on the basis that the child is capable of survival outside the womb without what the legislation calls extraordinary life-saving measures. Extraordinary life-saving measures are what hospitals are about. Extraordinary life-saving measures are taken successfully in hospitals every day to save the lives of premature babies and indeed adults who have other illnesses. Yet, unless the legislation is changed, babies will be killed who would not otherwise be killed, who would otherwise benefit from extraordinary life-saving measures and be allowed to live. They will be killed under head 4 of the legislation. And that, to my mind, is going far too far. Another area where I think there is serious ground for promoting amendments to the legislation is in respect of the mental health excuse for abortion. We're to have a situation whereby if two doctors believe there is a risk of serious harm to the mental health of the child mother, a non-viable, supposedly non-viable baby can be aborted, killed. Well, first of all, what this is asking those doctors to do is to say, not what's the mental health state of the woman at the moment, but what her future mental health state might be if she had the baby. It's a hypothetical speculation that these two doctors are being asked to engage in as a basis for abortion. Now, hypothetical speculation should never be a basis for ending somebody's life, and yet that's what's to happen. And indeed, the legislation doesn't even say that a psychiatrist must be one of the doctors making the judgment. 2 doctors are enough, with appropriate qualifications, whatever that is. So I think I have illustrated, referring to the legislation, those points I've made, that there is plenty of work for you to do in respectful conversation with your local TDs, your local senators, with your local councillors, with anybody who's in a position to influence any of the parties in the Dáil who could have an influence on this legislation. That's the way the climate of opinion can and must be changed. I'd now like to look back at the recent referendum debate and see what can be learned from it. The reaction of those who won the referendum was not always magnanimous or respectful of the pluralist nature of Irish society and Irish values. For example, the Minister for Health, speaking in the Dáil after the referendum on the 31st of May, did not seem to me, and his speech is still up on his website for anyone who wants to read it, he's very proud of it, he has it on the website still. That speech did not seem to display the balance and attentiveness to other points of view that one would hope for in a minister who's going to be considering the amendments on the topics, the difficult topics that I've just referred to. He spoke in that speech on the 31st of May of the referendum inaugurating what he called a brighter Ireland. It will not be a bright Ireland for the little babies who will have their lives ended before ever being allowed to see the light of a single Irish day. He talked of the referendum result consigning a misogynistic legacy to the history books. He did not seem to reflect on the fact that half of the babies whose lives will be ended before they're born will be girls. Those little girls will face the most extreme possible form of misogyny. He claimed the Yes campaign was built on a coalition of compassion. He thus seemed to imply that those of us who voted no are not compassionate. Maybe this is not what he meant, but it could be implied that that was what he was saying. If it was, nothing could be further from the truth. He spoke of the referendum meaning that we are maturing, I'm using his words, maturing into a tolerant, non-judgmental, inclusive republic. The minister's own speech seemed to me to be extremely judgmental and not at all inclusive. In a mature republic, one would win magnanimously. One would listen respectfully to minority points of view and endeavour, in the national interest, representing all the people of Ireland, those who voted yes and those who voted no, to craft the legislation in a way that will truly respect Irish values. The recent referendum campaign does prompt a reflection on the values that inform Irish society at the present time. If life is not a primary value, and it would appear that for a majority of Irish people it's not anymore, what is the primary value? As I said, to fill that vacant space, to answer that vital question, the pro-life movement must be active and repeat your arguments over and over again to the young people of Ireland and to the generations that will succeed them. And I commend the initiatives that were explained to us tonight that are being taken to that end. These arguments that are being made now will influence decisions that may be made, life and death decisions that may be made by young women and their families 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now. By some casual conversation that one of you may have had with somebody may in fact be that word, that thought that remained in their head that will help somebody to make the decision to allow their baby to live. So do not hesitate to express your view, but be sure to do it in the most sympathetic and humble way you can. The campaign also, I think, revealed unacknowledged contradictions in the Irish value system. For example, the recent referendum sits very uneasily beside the deep and genuine concern expressed in all quarters for the welfare of boys and girls after they are born. Indeed, we've passed a special referendum on children's rights to increase the capacity of the state to intervene to protect the rights of children after they are born. Yet, we've taken away such rights as those same children enjoyed before they were born. That's contradictory. The repeal of the Eighth Amendment also sits uneasily beside the expressions of concern, of which we've heard very much in recent weeks for reasons I think we all understand, expressions of concern about how babies who died 50 years ago in mother and baby homes were buried. Where and how will the supposedly non-viable babies who will be aborted in Irish hospitals once this legislation is passed be buried? What care will the state take to ensure that they get a dignified burial? What care will the churches take to ensure that they get a dignified burial? Or will we have a Tuam inquiry all over again? Because we will find that these viable babies have been treated as mere hospital waste. Human rights organisations in Ireland and elsewhere justly pride themselves in speaking up for the rights of those who cannot speak for themselves, for those whose voices are not heard because they are politically powerless or just plain unpopular. But in Ireland, human rights organisations in the recent campaign did not play that role. Irish human rights organisations ignored unborn children as if they were, to use the great Stalinist phrase, unpersons. When an unborn child has its life deliberately ended, it is not presented by these organisations and wasn't presented in the campaign as a victim. Apparently, the only victims that count in the eyes of Irish human rights organisations are the victims who survive. But abortion involves a victim, a death, a victim that never gets a chance to be a survivor. For me, every person counts, whether the person be born or unborn, visible or invisible, mute or eloquent, here or abroad. If we're to use referenda to make big decisions, we need to be sure that voters are fully equipped for the role they have as citizen legislators. And we need to ask ourselves, what influences the way people make decisions, like the recent one that they made, or the decision that our neighbours made on Brexit, or the decisions others have made in referenda? One needs to know how the consensus changed and can it be reversed. Did emotion trump rational argument? I think in some cases it did. Did people examine the issue on its merits, on its human rights, fundamental merits, on the humanity of the unborn child? Did they consider that? Or did they instead simply desire to conform to some notion of what it is to be modern and progressive? I'm afraid some people took the latter course. There can be a conformist consensus in the Irish media. Indeed, it could be said that the Irish media, and indeed perhaps the Irish people, are like starlings. They're all going in one direction at one time, And then eventually, this is the hopeful part, they turn and they start going the other direction. So, think of the starlings, don't lose hope. Remember, it was this sort of conformism in the Irish media, and let's acknowledge the fact that professional journalists are forced to report on a daily basis on things that they don't really understand, but they have to report on them against a very short deadline, and they write, therefore, what they write to conform to some sort of received consensus that they've picked up in the newsroom from other journalists. That's how this flock of starlings tends to move, one direction or the other. Remember also that it was precisely that sort of conformist thinking that led to the Celtic bubble in Ireland between 2000 and 2008, where nothing was questioned. There was only one way to think: buy a house in Bulgaria, spend more, all these various things. That sort of tendency led us into trouble in economics, and it is now leading us into trouble in public morality. But we learned our lesson as far as the economics is concerned, and I have no doubt we'll learn our lesson as well on the issue of what is a human life. In the social media as well, people tend to congregate in online communities which basically reinforce their prejudices and prevent them from thinking. In these circumstances, it is very hard for those with unfashionable views to get a look in. And that's not good for the quality of democracy. So, for the sake of Irish democracy, you must continue to make the arguments that you made over the last several months. The arguments are still valid, and the need for you to speak up and have the courage to do so is as great as ever. To say that a child has full human rights after birth and none before it is unscientific and inherently contradictory. How then did the Irish public decide to come to end the constitutional right to life of an unborn child? How did they do it? I think it all came down to the question of visibility. The mother of the unborn baby and the dilemmas she faces or fears she might face are visible. The unborn baby is largely invisible. But if one puts visible suffering above invisible suffering, one is no longer applying a universal moral standard. And I believe the whole notion of universal human rights, which we hear about every day, rests on the assumption that there is such a thing as a universal moral standard. And that's why I found the attitude of Irish human rights organisations in the recent referendum so deeply troubling. I say it again, there is a hierarchy of rights and responsibilities. The right to life should be at the top of any hierarchy of rights. I will conclude by saying that there is much work to be done. There will have, obviously, to be a new approach in a new legal context. Yes, in the short term, one must continue to focus on what the laws say, and that can still be changed. But even more important is influencing the climate of public opinion in the longer term. And that's where your work is so important. And it is important also to acknowledge that that work has already yielded good results. In recent years, the number of abortions undertaken by Irish women has been declining. Notwithstanding the change in the law, if you keep up your respectful argument, the number of abortions will continue to decline. If people are convinced that there is a better and more just way. Lighting that way forward is the real route to a brighter Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you, John.